In the autumn of 1887, while Cedar Ridge hoarded firewood, the widowed schoolteacher Catherine Foster nailed hundreds of black-painted tin cans to the schoolhouse's south wall. She connected them with stovepipe ducts, a dark honeycomb facing the low sun. The board called it a wall of garbage and refused her extra fuel. If her contraption failed, the children would freeze. If it worked, she would beat every stove in the territory without burning a stick. Catherine Foster was a widow who taught 27 children in a one-room schoolhouse on the Nebraska frontier, where winter mornings meant ink frozen in the inkwells and children shivering through their sums. The county board had given her a stove but rationed the firewood severely, expecting the children to suffer or stay home. Instead, Catherine spent her summer collecting discarded tin cans, painting them black, and mounting them into a primitive solar collector, a technology no one in the territory had ever used for heating a building. To the board, it was junk. To Catherine, it was a gamble that the low prairie sun could be captured and turned into usable heat. The question that winter wasn't just whether her contraption would keep the school warm. It was whether a woman with no scientific training, armed with nothing but observation, could outperform every cast-iron stove in Cedar Ridge using nothing but light. What the board didn't know was that hidden inside that wall of cans was a principle that would one day launch an entire generation of engineers. And even Catherine herself had no idea that the children she was trying to save were already taking notes. Catherine Foster had not always been a woman who argued with school boards. Before Cedar Ridge, before the tin cans and the stove that sat cold on overcast days, she had been a farm wife in eastern Ohio, married to a man named Thomas who believed that the world could be understood if you simply watched it long enough. Thomas had been a tinkerer. He kept notebooks filled with sketches of water wheels and seed drills, observations about frost patterns and bird migrations. He taught Catherine to read the angle of the sun across their fields at different times of year, to notice how the dark soil warmed faster in spring than the pale clay, to understand that heat was not just a thing you burned wood to create, but a thing that moved and could be captured. When Thomas died of pneumonia in 1883, Catherine was left with a small wagon, his notebooks, and no children of her own. She took a teaching certificate and moved west, eventually settling in Cedar Ridge, a town of roughly 300 people perched on the edge of the Nebraska prairie, where the wind had nothing to stop it between the Rockies and the Missouri River. The Cedar Ridge schoolhouse was a single room built from milled cottonwood planks, 30 feet long and 20 feet wide, with a pitched roof and a potbelly stove that stood near the north wall like a cast-iron god. In September, the stove was an afterthought. By November, it was the only thing keeping 27 children from frostbite. The county school board, led by a dry goods merchant named Horace Dunlop, allocated firewood by the cord based on what they called standard winter requirements. Standard requirements meant enough wood to keep the stove burning from 8 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, 5 days a week, provided the teacher managed the fuel carefully, and the children did not waste heat by opening the door more than necessary. But Cedar Ridge winters were not standard. The prairie wind drove cold through the cottonwood planks like water through a sieve. On clear days, the sun offered warmth through the south-facing windows, but those days were rare between December and March. Most mornings, Catherine arrived to find the ink frozen solid in the inkwells, the children's breath visible in pale clouds above their desks, and the stove consuming its rationed logs far faster than the board's calculations allowed. By January of 1886, Catherine had spent her own wages twice to buy extra firewood from the mill when the school's ration ran out before the end of the month. She petitioned the board for an additional half-cord. Horace Dunlop denied the request. The budget was fixed, he explained. Other schools in the county managed with the same allocation. If Cedar Ridge needed more, perhaps the teacher was not managing the stove properly. Catherine sat across from him in the back room of his dry goods store, surrounded by barrels of flour and stacked bolts of cloth, and tried to explain that her children were suffering. Dunlop listened with the patient expression of a man who had already decided. The board would not increase the fuel allowance. The school would make do. That summer, while the prairie grass turned brown and the cicadas sang in the cottonwoods, Cuthbertson began collecting tin cans. Every homestead had them. Oyster cans from the general store, tomato cans, peach cans, lard tins, discarded by the dozens behind kitchens and barns. Cuthbertson paid the town's children a penny for every 10 cans they brought her, and soon the shed behind the schoolhouse was piled high with rusted metal. She soaked the cans in vinegar water to remove the labels, scrubbed the solder joints clean, and laid them out in long rows in the sun. Then she painted every single one with black paint mixed from lampblack and linseed oil, a recipe she had found in one of Thomas's old notebooks. Black absorbs heat. Thomas had written that in the margin next to a sketch of a water tank. He had proved it himself by painting 2 wooden boxes, one black and one white, and setting them in the July sun. The black box had been 20 degrees warmer by noon. Cuthbertson had read that entry a dozen times. Now she was testing it at a scale no one in Cedar Ridge could comprehend. The design was simple in principle, but punishing in execution. Cuthbertson removed the wooden siding from the entire south wall of the schoolhouse and built a frame from scrap lumber to hold the cans in staggered rows. Each can had a hole punched in the bottom and another near the top. When stacked vertically and connected by short lengths of stovepipe, the cans formed continuous columns like dark metal chimneys laid horizontally against the wall. Cold air would enter at the bottom, rise as it warmed, and exit through a duct near the ceiling into the classroom. No fire, no smoke, no fuel, only the sun hitting black metal. The people of Cedar Ridge noticed the construction before Cuthbertson had finished the first row. Horace Dunlop came to inspect it himself, standing in the dry grass with his hands on his hips, squinting at the wall of tin cans with open disbelief. He asked what she intended to do with such a thing. Cuthbertson explained the principle calmly. Sunlight would heat the black metal. The metal would heat the air inside. The hot air would rise naturally into the classroom. Dunlop listened, then laughed. Not a cruel laugh, but the dismissive laugh of a man who believed he understood the world better than a widow with a pile of garbage. He told her the board would not waste money on such foolishness. Cuthbertson replied that she had not asked for money. She had only asked for permission to try. Word of the wall spread through Cedar Ridge faster than fire. Farmers coming into town for supplies stopped their wagons to stare at the strange black honeycomb growing across the schoolhouse face. Some called it the Tin Can Palace. Others simply shook their heads and said it was a shame what happened to women left alone without husbands to guide them. The children, meanwhile, watched their teacher with something closer to fascination than mockery. They had seen her scrub cans until her hands cracked. They had helped her punch holes with a hammer and a thick nail, had carried buckets of lamp-black paint, had held the stovepipe sections steady while she wired them into place. They did not fully understand what she was building, but they understood that she was working harder on their behalf than anyone else ever had. 3 of those children would later become engineers. But in the autumn of 1887, they were simply cold kids who wanted to believe their teacher had found a way to beat winter without burning wood. The first frost arrived during the 3rd week of October, earlier than predicted, and with it came the first real test of Cuthbertson's solar collector. She arrived at the schoolhouse before dawn on a morning when the temperature had fallen to 23 degrees overnight. The stove was cold. The rationed firewood would not arrive for another 2 weeks. Cuthbertson opened the lower vents on her new wall, positioned herself near the south windows, and waited for the sun to climb above the eastern prairie. The cans were cold to the touch. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass like something hungry. If the collector failed to produce meaningful heat, Horace Dunlop would have his proof that the widow's experiment was a waste of time, and Cuthbertson Foster would have to face 27 shivering children with nothing to offer them but a stove that could not be lit. What happened when the sun finally struck that wall of black tin cans would change Cedar Ridge forever, but it did not happen the way Cuthbertson expected. Because hidden in the design was a flaw she had not anticipated, a quiet mistake buried in the angles of the ductwork, and by the time she discovered it, The temperature inside the classroom was already climbing toward a number that defied every law of frontier heating. But the real shock was not the heat itself. It was what the heat revealed. The sun cleared the eastern horizon at 7:04 that morning, low and pale gold against the frost-silvered prairie. Cuthbertson stood near the south windows with one hand pressed flat against a black-painted can, waiting. For the first 3 minutes, nothing happened. The metal remained cold beneath her palm, and somewhere behind her, a child coughed into the silence. Then the first column of cans began to tick. Soft, almost musical, the sound of thin metal expanding as heat found its surface. The children turned toward the sound. A boy named Thomas Rudfun, age 11, would later recall that he thought the wall was coming alive. By 7:20, the temperature inside the classroom had climbed from 38 degrees to 46. By 7:40, it passed 52, then 58. Cuthbertson held a glass thermometer borrowed from Dr. Hulla's medical kit and watched the mercury rise with something close to disbelief. The Putbully stove sat cold and dark against the north wall, dead iron that had governed the school's comfort for years. By 8:05, the room stood at 63 degrees while the outdoor air hovered near freezing. Children began unbuttoning coats. One girl, Aliza Hulbertsk, pulled off her wool mittens and held her hands toward the upper vent as warm air spilled into the room, not with the harsh bite of stove heat, but with a steady, gentle breath that smelled faintly of lampblack and old peaches. The wall was working, but the real shock was not the heat itself. It was what the heat revealed about the children. Within the first hour, Cuthbertson noticed something she had never seen in a frontier classroom. The children did not simply huddle near the warmth and return to their readers. They began asking questions. Muthadura, a lanky 12-year-old whose father ran the livery stable, wanted to know why the top cans were hotter than the bottom ones. Aliza Hulbertsk asked how light could become heat at all. Thomas Rudfun pulled a scrap of paper from his tablet and tried to sketch the path of air through the ductwork, drawing arrows with a worn pencil stub. Cuthbertson stood at the front of the room and realized that the wall was not just a heater. It was the most effective teacher of natural philosophy Cedar Ridge had ever seen. So instead of opening the arithmetic primer, she asked the children to help her map the temperature at every desk. They spent the next 30 minutes moving the thermometer from seat to seat, calling out readings while Cuthbertson wrote numbers on the blackboard. 59 degrees at the window seats, 67 at the desks nearest the center return duct, a sharp drop to 48 in the back corner where cold air leaked through a gap in the floorboards. The heat was uneven, and that unevenness told a story. That night after the children had gone home, Cuthbertson reopened Thomas's notebook to a page she had marked months earlier. Hot air rises and must be returned to the occupied zone before it pools against the ceiling. He had written beneath a diagram of a greenhouse. She looked up at the classroom ceiling and understood the problem immediately. The upper return vent was too small and positioned too high. Warm air was collecting above the children's heads while their feet stayed cold. The design was not wrong exactly. It was incomplete, like a sentence missing its final clause. Cuthbertson spent the next 3 evenings rebuilding the return duct system with scrap lumber and an old damper hinge from the blacksmith. She cut a second register into the wall at shoulder height and installed a simple flap the children could adjust from their seats. The flap directed warm air downward instead of letting it drift uselessly along the rafters. It was a small modification, but it changed everything. The next morning, for the first time, the temperature at every desk stayed within 4 degrees of 65. The wall was no longer merely functional. It was precise. Horace Dunlop arrived without warning 5 days later. He stepped through the schoolhouse door at 10 in the morning, expecting to find children huddled in coats around a failing experiment. Instead, he found 27 students working sums in shirt sleeves while Cuthbertson wrote Latin declensions on the board. The room was warm. Not tolerably warm, comfortably, undeniably warm. Dunlop stood near the door for a long moment without speaking. His eyes moved across the blackened cans, the stovepipe ducts, the new damper that Aliza Hulbertsk had adjusted only minutes earlier. He did not ask about the temperature. He asked whether Catherine had obtained board approval for her modifications. She replied that she had not asked because the board had already made its position clear. Dunlaw's jaw tightened. He called the wall an uncertified structure and hinted that if it interfered with the children's education, the board would be forced to act. Then he left, but not before Matthew Dura raised his hand and asked Catherine a question loud enough for the departing board chairman to hear. How does a damper change the airflow pressure? Catherine smiled and began drawing a cross-section of the duct on the blackboard. The arithmetic lesson could wait. Word of the tin can wall spread beyond Cedar Ridge. In late November, a county superintendent named Arthur Ulsworth rode out from the seat in Broken Bow after hearing rumors of a schoolhouse heated by sunlight. Ulsworth was a thin, spectacled man who had once studied at Upclon and believed that frontier education needed to move beyond rote recitation. He inspected the wall with the careful attention of a man who understood what he was looking at. He measured the can columns, noted the blackbody principle behind the lampblack paint, and asked Catherine to explain the damper mechanism. Then he spoke to the children. He asked Thomas Rudfund to describe the temperature gradient between the floor and ceiling. Thomas answered without hesitation. He asked Eliza Holbertsk what would happen if the cans were painted white instead of black. Eliza considered for a moment, then replied that white cans would reflect most of the sunlight and produce almost no heat at all. Ulsworth looked at Catherine with an expression that was not quite surprise. It was recognition. He told her that he had never seen a schoolhouse teach physics through its own walls. He returned to Broken Bow and wrote a report to the state superintendent, recommending that other schools consider adopting the Cedar Ridge solar heating method. The report was published in the county newspaper on December 2nd, alongside an editorial that praised Catherine Foster's ingenuity. Horace Dunlaw read it from the back counter of his dry goods store and did not speak for nearly an hour. But the newspaper report did not settle the matter. It inflamed it. The board now faced a public embarrassment. They had doned Catherine extra firewood, mocked her wall, and now a county official was calling her a model of frontier innovation. Dunlaw's response was swift. He called a special board meeting and argued that the wall was a safety hazard. The lampblack paint, he claimed, was flammable. The stovepipe connections could leak fumes into the classroom. The structure itself was unengineered and might collapse onto children at any moment. None of these claims were true, but truth was not the point. The point was to create doubt. The board voted to withhold the school's remaining winter firewood ration until Catherine removed the solar collector from the south wall. The message was delivered by the town marshal on December 9th. Catherine read it while snow flurries whitened the schoolhouse windows and understood exactly what the board intended. They meant to freeze her into submission. For 2 days, the children watched their teacher carry the weight of the decision in silence. Then, on the 3rd day, the weather turned against all of them. A cold front rolled down from the Dakota Territory, driving temperatures to 12 degrees below freezing by Mudmanong. The sky stayed glazed with thin cloud, pale and watery, offering almost no usable sunlight. The wall produced barely enough warmth to keep the classroom above 45 degrees. Catherine burned the last of her scrap wood in the potbelly stove before noon, and by 2 o'clock the room was cooling again. The board's gambit had succeeded. Without firewood, the school would become uninhabitable by the next morning, with or without the solar collector. That night, as Catherine sat alone in the dark schoolhouse, the 3 future engineers made a decision of their own. Thomas Rudfund, Eliza Holbertsk, and Matthew Dura gathered in the livery stable after supper with a copy of Ulsworth's newspaper report and a notebook filled with measurements they had been recording for weeks. They had tracked outdoor temperatures at dawn, midday, and dusk. They had documented how many hours of sunlight struck the wall each day and how many logs Catherine had fed into the backup stove. They had collected enough data to prove that the wall had saved nearly a full quart of firewood between November 1st and December 10th, more than the board's ration had ever provided. Matthew's father helped them turn their notebook into a formal letter, and Thomas's mother insisted they present it at the public meeting Dunlaw had called for December 14th. Word of the children's evidence spread through Cedar Ridge faster than the cold itself. Parents who had once laughed at the tin can wall started listening to their own children describe how it worked. The town was no longer simply divided between Ketherton and the board. It was divided between those who still believed the wall was a dangerous folly, and those who had begun to suspect that the board's real fear was not safety at all. It was being proven wrong by a widow and a classroom full of children who now understood thermodynamics better than most grown men. The meeting was set for the evening of December 14th, inside the very schoolhouse whose south wall now stood as both evidence and symbol, black cans catching the last light of the prairie sun, while the temperature outside fell toward zero. Cuthbert and Foster stood beside the damper handle, watching the townspeople fill the benches where her students sat each morning. Horace Dunlop rose first, gripping the lectern, prepared to demand the wall's destruction. But before he could speak more than a sentence, Thomas Rudfund stood up from the back row, clutching a sheaf of papers in a hand still marked with lamp-black stains, and Catherine saw in his face something she had not expected. Not fear, not anger, certainty. The meeting was already half lost. Horace Dunlop had risen behind the teacher's lectern like a man who believed the room was still his, breathing the stale authority of the board's decision into the cold air before a single word left his mouth. He opened with the same inventory of fears he had rehearsed in the back of his dry goods store. Uncertified structure, fire hazard, a reckless experiment conducted on county property without approval. The words landed flat. The room was full of parents whose children had spent the past month describing the temperature gradient between the floor and ceiling at dinner tables, explaining why black tins absorbed heat while white ones would not, and telling stories of a teacher who had paid them a penny to carry garbage that now warmed their desks. Dunlop could feel the shift, but did not possess the imagination to believe it could unseat him. So he pressed harder. He called the wall a disgrace to practical education and moved that it be dismantled by the end of the week. That was when Thomas Rudfund rose. His hand still carried the faint shadow of lamp-black ground into the creases of his knuckles. He asked permission to read something into the record. When Dunlop hesitated, a half-dozen parents simply told the boy to speak. What Thomas held was not a petition. It was a scientific brief. Month by month, he read the daily temperatures Catherton had recorded, the hours of direct sunlight, and the corresponding burn times of the backup stove. From November 1st through December 10th, the solar wall had cut the school's firewood consumption by 62% compared to the previous winter's ration. On clear days, the classroom maintained an average temperature of 65 degrees for less than 1/10 of a cord per week. On overcast days, the wall still contributed enough passive heat to reduce the stove's load by nearly half. The numbers were not estimates. They had been measured with the same glass thermometer Dr. Hulla used to track fevers, checked 3 times daily by the children themselves. Thomas concluded with a simple statement that sounded less like a schoolboy and more like an engineer giving testimony. The wall had saved the county more than a full cord of firewood in 40 days. By the board's own accounting, that wood was now worth more than the cost of the paint and scrap piping Catherton had used to build it. Dunlop's face drained of color. The room was silent for the space of 2 breaths. Then Eliza Hulbertsk rose from the same bench. She did not read. She simply pointed toward the wall and explained that if the board removed it, the school would need to burn the same amount of wood the board had already refused to provide. Her logic was as clean as a cold morning. Take the wall down, and the children freeze. A farmer near the door muttered that his own daughter knew more about the workings of heat than the whole board combined. Laughter rippled through the room, sharp and ruthless. Dunlop motioned for order, but the dam had broken. Muthiadura's father, a man who had once laughed at the wall himself, stood and demanded to know why the board had voted to withhold the school's firewood ration in the first place. What possible purpose could starving a schoolhouse of fuel serve except to punish a teacher for proving that the board was wrong? Dunlop had no answer that would hold. He muttered something about budget protocols, then fell silent. The motion to dismantle the wall did not pass. It did not even come to a vote. The board chairman sat down amid jeers and an uneasy quiet that was worse than the shouting. That silence was still settling over Cedar Ridge when the weather delivered its own verdict. On December 18th, a cold wave pushed down from the Canadian plains, the kind of storm that frontier elders measured not in snow depth but in livestock losses. The temperature fell to 17 degrees below zero. Wind screamed across the open prairie at 40 miles an hour, driving the wind chill to a number that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Families banked their stoves full and still woke to find house frost creeping across the inner walls of their cabins. The general store ran out of coal oil. The mill sold its last quart of split pine before noon. In the Cedar Ridge schoolhouse, Cuthbertson faced the storm with a stove that held barely enough wood to last 3 hours and a wall that watched the sky. The sky, for the worst hours of that storm, was not blue. It was a bruised and swirling gray that let through only a pale wash of light. The wall would not produce 70-degree heat. It could not. But it did something that reframed every argument Dunla had ever made. It held. By mudmonang, the classroom stood at 49 degrees while the outside air clawed at the windows. The children wore coats, but they were not shivering uncontrollably. The wall's passive heat, even in weak light, was adding nearly 15 degrees to the ambient temperature, enough to keep ink liquid at the desks and the children's hands functional for writing. Cuthbertson lit the stove only during the darkest interval, nursing a few split logs that would have been swallowed whole in any other winter. The air circulated through the return ducts with a low hum. The damper set precisely where Eliza had calculated it should be to push warm air down into the occupied zone. Word spread through town that the school was still open. By afternoon, 3 neighboring families whose cabins had become uninhabitable arrived at the schoolhouse door with blankets and small children. Cuthbertson moved the benches aside and made room for them on the floor. The solar wall did not produce a miracle. It produced consistency, the one thing no cast-iron stove could guarantee on the open prairie. And in a crisis, consistency was survival. Horace Dunla spent that same storm trapped in his dry goods store when his own stovepipe iced over and backed smoke into the building. The following morning, he was discovered by the marshal half-frozen in the rear storeroom, wrapped in flour sacks and cursing the cold. The image was not lost on Cedar Ridge. The man who had tried to strip firewood from the schoolhouse had nearly become the winter's victim himself, while the schoolhouse he called a fire hazard had sheltered 24 people through the worst night of the year. The board's authority evaporated in the space of a single storm, but that was not the thing that finally broke Dunla's grip on the narrative. Something far larger was already moving beyond the borders of Cedar Ridge. On December 22nd, a letter arrived at the schoolhouse from the office of the state superintendent of public instruction in Lincoln. Arthur Ulsworth had forwarded Cuthbertson's method and the children's data to the capital, and the state's chief educational officer had taken an interest. The letter asked Cuthbertson to prepare a formal report describing the construction, cost, and performance of her solar collector for publication in the state's agricultural circular. The circular reached every county seat, every land office, every homestead claim between the Missouri and the Rockies. The letter also enclosed a draft for $30, approved by the state board, to reimburse Cuthbertson for the materials she had purchased from her own wages. Dunla read the letter after it was posted on the general store bulletin board by a parent who understood exactly what she was doing. He did not speak publicly about the wall again for the remainder of his term. But the story does not end with a letter or a disgraced board chairman. It ends with the children. During the final weeks of January, while deep snow still covered the prairie and the solar wall stood dark and warm against the south face of the school, Cuthbertson began teaching natural philosophy in earnest. She used the wall itself as a text. The children learned that heat moved in 3 ways: radiation, convection, conduction. The sun radiated energy across 93 million miles of vacuum. The Blackkens absorbed that radiation and conducted it to the air inside. The air rose through convection and warmed the room. They learned that the angle of the sun changed with the season, and that the wall's efficiency depended on the low winter sun striking it more directly than the high summer sun. They learned to calculate surface area and heat flux with chalk on rough planks. They built small replica collectors from scrap and tested them in the snow, racing to see whose design could melt the most ice in a fixed time. The classroom became a laboratory, and three children in particular never forgot what they learned inside its walls. Thomas Rudfun, the boy who had stood before the board with hands blackened by lampblack, would later attend the University of Nebraska and design irrigation systems that rerouted water across the sandhills using principles of thermal convection he first observed in a row of painted tin cans. Eliza Hulbertsk would earn a scholarship to Upclun and become one of the first women in the state to hold a degree in mechanical engineering, specializing in passive solar building design. Matthew Dira would work as a civil engineer for the Union Pacific, and in 1901, he would install a solar hot water system on his own house in Omaha, telling a reporter that the idea had come from a schoolteacher who once nailed garbage to the wall and called it science. All three of them, decades later, would write letters crediting the wall of Miss Kithup, not just as an invention, as the thing that taught them the world could be understood, not merely endured. But before any of that, before the degrees and the careers and the legacy, there was a single winter after the great blizzard when the temperature dropped once more to 20 below, and the sky stayed clear and pale blue, and the solar wall, now refined with better dampers and Tutta duck seals, pushed the classroom temperature to 72 degrees by 10 in the morning without a single stick of wood in the stove. Kithup stood at the window, watching the children pull off their coats and settle into their lessons, while outside the snowfield stretched white and unbroken to the horizon. She had beaten every stove in the territory without burning a log, and the school board, which had once called her collector a wall of garbage, now sat silent in a building colder than the one she taught in. For the remainder of that winter, the solar wall on the Cedar Ridge schoolhouse became a landmark in more ways than one. Travelers crossing the frozen prairie could spot the dark honeycomb from a mile away, a black rectangle against a white world, and they would often stop their wagons to ask the same question: how does it work? Kithup never turned them away. She had long ago stopped trying to defend the idea and had started simply demonstrating it. She would lead visitors inside, point to the thermometer, explain the damper, and let the children do the rest. Thomas Rudfun would describe the absorption of radiant energy. Eliza Hulbertsk would draw the convection loop on the blackboard. Matthew Dura would calculate how much firewood had been saved that month. The visitors left not just impressed but unsettled, because they realized they had just been taught physics by children who could barely see over the lectern. Several of those visitors were school board members from neighboring districts who rode home and quietly began to wonder if their own schools might do the same. By the spring of 1888, the State Agricultural Circular had published Kithup's full report. It ran across 3 pages with diagrams drawn by the children themselves, showing the can arrangement, the ductwork, and the damper mechanism. The circular credited Kithup Foster as the originator of the Cedar Ridge solar heating method, a phrase that would be repeated in at least 7 other newspapers over the following year. Horace Dunlop left the school board after his term expired and never held public office again. His dry goods store remained open, but it was said that he would cross the street rather than walk past the schoolhouse when the sun was shining. The report triggered a small wave of experimentation. Within 2 years, at least 11 schoolhouses across the Nebraska Territory had installed some version of a solar collector based on Kithup's design. Most used tin cans, though one enterprising teacher near Grand Island substituted sheet metal boxes painted with stove blacking. A farmer in Custa County built a collector on the south wall of his sod house and reported that he had cut his winter fuel bill by 40%. None of these imitators ever met Kithup, but they all read the same circular, and they all wrote to the same address. The letters arrived at the Cedar Ridge School in bundles, full of questions about can spacing and paint formulas, and Cuthbertson answered every one in longhand while the children practiced their penmanship on scrap paper. But the wall's greatest legacy was not the heat it produced. It was the people it shaped. Thomas Rudfun graduated from the Cedar Ridge School in 1891 and traveled east to Lincoln, where he enrolled in the mechanical arts program at the university. His entrance examination essay was a description of the solar wall and its thermal dynamics. The examining professor noted in the margins that he had rarely read such a lucid explanation of convective heat transfer from a freshman. Thomas would go on to design irrigation systems that used gravity-fed convection to move water across dry farmland, a principle he first grasped by watching warm air rise through a column of peach tins. In 1902, he published a brief memoir in a small agricultural journal in which he wrote, "Everything I know about the movement of fluids I first saw in a schoolhouse wall built by a woman who had no degree, no money, and no opponent she was afraid to face." Eliza Holbertsk earned a scholarship to Upclon College in 1893, one of only 3 women in the engineering preparatory program. On her first day of thermodynamics, the professor asked the class to define a blackbody radiator. Eliza raised her hand and gave an answer that made the professor pause: a surface that absorbs nearly all incident radiation and re-emits it as heat, such as lamp-black paint on a tin can. The professor asked how she knew this. She told him she had tested it herself at the age of 12 in a one-room schoolhouse on the Nebraska frontier. After graduating, Eliza worked for a firm in Chicago that designed passive solar systems for apartment buildings, a field that would not become common for another 50 years. She kept a single black-painted tin can on her desk throughout her career, not as decoration, but as a reminder that good science could begin with garbage. Mathiadera took a job with the Union Pacific as a surveyor and eventually rose to the position of district engineer. In 1906, he was asked to design a series of remote switching stations along the transcontinental line that needed to remain operational through harsh Wyoming winters. His solution was a solar hot water system that preheated water for the station boilers before coal was applied, cutting fuel consumption by nearly a third. A reporter from the Omaha Bee interviewed him and asked where the idea had come from. Muthia replied, "From a wall of tin cans built by a teacher named Cuthbertson Foster. I spent 40 mornings in her classroom measuring temperature differences, and I have never stopped measuring them since." All 3 of them wrote letters to Cuthbertson before she died. Thomas wrote from the irrigation project in the Sandhills, describing a pumping station that moved water uphill using thermal siphons. Eliza wrote from Chicago, enclosing a diagram of a passive solar apartment building she had designed for a cooperative housing society. Muthia wrote from the high plains of Wyoming, describing the switching stations that now hummed through winter storms on half the coal they used to burn. And every letter contained a version of the same sentence: "You taught me that the world could be understood." Cuthbertson Foster never rummaried. She taught at the Cedar Ridge School until 1902, when rheumatism forced her to retire. She moved into a small frame house on the edge of town, where she continued to answer letters from far-flung teachers and tinkerers who had read the state circular. In her final years, she told a neighbor that she had not set out to invent anything. She had only tried to keep children warm. The wall, by then, had been standing on the schoolhouse for 15 winters. The cans had needed repainting twice, and the ductwork had been replaced with proper sheet metal in 1898, but the principle remained unchanged. The school board, after Dunlaw's departure, had quietly voted to pay for the maintenance from the general fund. The wall that had once been called garbage was now an official county asset. One afternoon in the autumn of 1903, an architect from Denver named Walter Kumball arrived in Cedar Ridge with a camera and a notebook. He had been researching frontier building techniques and had stumbled across the state circular in an archive. He asked to photograph the wall and interview the teacher who had built it. Cuthbertson was too ill to stand for long, so she sat in a chair on the schoolhouse porch while Kumball took his photographs. He asked her why she had chosen tin cans. She replied that they were cheap, light, and already everywhere. She had not needed to order them from a catalog or wait for a shipment to arrive. The frontier rewarded people who used what was in front of them. Cumbo wrote that sentence down and later cited it in a book he published on vernacular building practices. The book became a standard text in architecture programs for decades. Cutharne's name appeared in the footnotes. The surprising detail that almost no one alive today knows is this: the solar wall that beat every stove in the territory was never intended to be permanent. Cutharne had originally planned to remove the cans in the spring of 1888, after the board's challenge was settled and the experiment had proven its point. But the children refused to let her. When she announced that the wall would come down after the thaw, a delegation of students led by Thomas Rudfun presented her with a petition signed by every child in the school. They argued that the wall was not just a heater. It was their textbook. They had drawn their own diagrams on it with chalk, marked temperature readings between the cans, and learned to predict the day's indoor conditions by looking at the sky. To remove it, they said, would be like burning a library. Cutharne read the petition twice, then filed it in the same drawer where she kept Thomas's notebook. The wall stayed up for another 17 years. Now, as you sit with that story, you might ask yourself the same question the state circular posed in its introduction to Cutharne Foster's report. Was what she did genius, or was it simply something that any observant person might have done if they were willing to look at a pile of junk and see a machine? And more importantly, what other machines are hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone with the nerve to build them? Cutharne Foster never sought fame, never filed a patent, never asked for more than a chance to keep her classroom warm. And yet her wall of black tin cans, built from refuse and painted with lampblack, produced heat that outperformed every cast-iron stove in the territory, taught a generation of children to think like engineers, and planted a seed that would grow into irrigation systems, passive solar buildings, and railroad switching stations 1,000 miles from the Nebraska prairie. She did not set out to change the way the frontier thought about energy. She simply observed what was already true, that the sun pours free heat onto the earth every clear day, and that a dark surface knows how to catch it. What made her different was not the knowledge itself. It was the willingness to act on it when everyone around her called the idea garbage. The wall is gone now. The Cedar Ridge schoolhouse was dismantled in 1921, and the cans were sold for scrap during the First World War. But the letters from Thomas, Eliza, and Methia still exist in a small archive in Lincoln, and the state circular that carried Cutharne's diagrams across the plains sits in a handful of university libraries, yellowed and brittle but still legible. It is one of the earliest published descriptions of a functioning solar air heater in North America, and it was written by a widow with a borrowed thermometer and a room full of children who wanted to learn. The story of the solar wall asks a question that has not aged a day since that first October morning when the cans began to tick with heat. What are we walking past right now, calling it junk, calling it foolish, calling it a waste of time, that might actually be a machine waiting for someone to finish it? Cutharne Foster saw a pile of discarded tin cans and recognized a collector. The children saw a wall and recognized a textbook. 3 of them grew up and recognized a career. And the winter, which had always been the enemy of frontier schools, became the very thing that proved the wall's worth. The same sun that fell on the frozen prairie fell on black metal, and that was enough. If you want to see more stories about the forgotten inventors and unlikely visionaries who built the world we inherited, hit subscribe and turn on the bell. History is full of people like Cutharne Foster, people who were told to sit down, be quiet, and let the experts handle things. People who refused. We tell their stories here. And the next time you see something that looks like garbage baking in the sun, you might ask yourself a different question than the one you would have asked before. You might not ask whether it is foolish. You might ask whether it is hot.